Bass guitar, I thought one of my great inspirations was Michael Jackson's brother, Jermaine Jackson.
Oh, Jermaine, yeah.
Because he was the bass player in the band. And I used to listen to these Jackson 5 records, and the bass parts were incredible. Came to find out later, it wasn't Jermaine. Because I was like, he's the baddest 14-year-old bass player ever in the world, you know? Turns out it was a guy named James Jemerson, who was the house bassist for all the Motown records.
I like the way you did that in Michael's voice.
Well, I had a similar voice at the time, you know what I mean? And I met Jermaine, I said, because although he wasn't playing on the records, in the concerts, he did have to play those things and do the steps and sing his part in the Jackson 5 songs, which are always too high for him because they were writing the songs for Michael, his younger brother. So when it's time for him to sing, he was always, So I thanked him. But anyway, it was James Jemerson. That was one of my first inspirations.
It was the linchpin of the Motown Funk Brothers.
Yeah, they've done documentaries on the Motown Funk Brothers. They were the house band for all the Motown songs. Motown never gave any credit to the musicians, the Detroit musicians who played on the Motown stuff, so we didn't know who they were until later on. But James Jemerson, and then there was a group called Sly and the Family Stone. And the bass player in Sly, his name was Larry Graham. And Larry Graham, most bass players have been playing up to that point the bass like this. It was a carryover from the contrabass when they used to play it. It's called pizzicato, when you pluck the strings with your fingers. And then bass guitar, they're playing the same way. Larry Graham didn't know the rules. So he started striking the bass with his thumb, plucking strings, very percussive, very funky. And he invented, we called it thumping and plucking at the time. They call it slap bass now. Big influence. Then I heard Stanley Clarke, who was playing with a group called Return to Forever.
Richard Corea.
And he was using all the techniques in his amazing facility, and just blew my mind. And then a guy named Jaco Pastorius, who played with Weather Report and played fretless bass beautifully. Those are the main guys, but there were so many others. The guy who played with the Crusaders, whose name was Popswell, and there are a lot of funk bass players, Bootsy Collins, and who else on the funk side? A guy named Paul Jackson, who played with Herbie Hancock and the Headhunters. He was a huge influence. So, it was just a bunch of guys, and I just listened to whoever I could. And then I got to a certain age, and I shut myself off. I stopped listening to other bass players, 17, 18 years old, because I really wanted to have my own style. And I realized I was developing a reputation for sounding like Jaco Pastorius or like Larry Graham. And I said, man, if I'm going to find my own thing, I got to stop listening to my heroes, And that's a big decision for a musician, to separate and go out into the water on your own, because before then, if I was doing a concert and things started going badly, I just whip out a Stanley Clarke lick, and everybody go, yeah!
Default position.
Yeah,
Anyway, here's a quote from you from an interview that we did way back when, and you're recalling your days as a studio musician. I remember telling my mum I'm on a commercial on TV. She saw it, but she was like, I don't hear no bass. So I thought, okay, the next time I'm on one of those commercials, let me experiment with a bright, slappy sound, because it might sound good on those small TV speakers. And that became the thing. So behind every great bass player, there's a mother. So tell us, it's a funny little anecdote, yet at the same time, it's very important because it reminds us of the importance of dynamics, the importance of volume, the importance of the audio environment, of who's actually listening to you, how they're listening to you. Tell me about that time and when you did start to change according to comments from your mom and other people.
Well, it also had to do with the technology at the time. Like we buy TVs now, and along with your TV comes a big subwoofer. You know what I mean? So you can hear the bass really clearly. You can watch movies on your TV at home now, and you can the room is shaking. But in 1977, 78, they didn't have those. TV speakers were tiny, so the bass, you really couldn't hear the bass. So my mom's like, I don't hear no bass. I'm like, man. So the next time I did a commercial, instead of using the normal pizzicato sound, I used that Larry Graham thumb. So the bass was much more bright. And the producers loved it because they were having the same problem. They were like, we really can't hear the bass on this thing. So I'm like, bang, boom, 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 boom. For like diaper commercials, I'm thumping through diaper commercials. And I developed a real facility. Up until that point, guys who played in that style, in that Larry Graham style, it was all energetic and it was really hard. But I developed a real dexterity with my thumb. I could do it lightly, I could do it heavy, I could do a lot of things with it. And I ended up using that in my style. I wanted a style really badly because the musicians I admired were people who you could identify in like 3 notes. You know, I love Miles. Oh, that's Miles, you know. John Coltrane, you know, Larry Graham, Stanley Clarke, Jaco Pastorius, all these guys really had really distinctive sounds. And I was looking for mine. And I was trying to just create things, like manufacture things that I said, I'm going to do this and it's going to be my sound. And then I go do my jingles and I do my commercials and I do whatever I was, you know, I had to do to pay my bills. And I go back to trying to find my sound. And little did I know that my sound was developing on its own over here, just reacting to regular life, you know. Somebody had told me that early on, you know, the way you find your sound is just live your life and play honestly, react to whatever it is, and it'll come out, you know. That's like some, you know, Zen stuff, you know what I mean? That when you're 15, you're like, oh, whatever, I don't know what that is. But that turned out to be the case. The stuff I was doing when I wasn't paying attention, I was just having fun, you know, just trying to be heard, you know. Coming from New York, you know, we'd play jazz in clubs in New York as teenagers where people weren't really interested in hearing jazz. You know what I mean? They wanted to dance, they wanted to do something else, and jazz was too cerebral. So we had to play jazz with a real attitude, you know, we used to play jazz with scowls on our face, like, we're gonna scare you into liking this jazz, you know what I mean? And we'd be playing, and I still play with a scowl to this day, you know? I can't get it up. I try to like lighten it up, and then when it gets deep, I start scowling again. But this is because, you know, we were playing in a really urban environment where we had to play aggressively. Yeah. We had to show the people that we were so committed to this music that we'd impress them just by our commitment.
You're responding to what's around you.
Responding to our environment. Yeah. And that's what makes me a New York musician. You know, guys will say, man, you sound like you're gonna kill somebody when you play. Man, that's how you had to play where I come from. You know, if you come from the South, you know, it's more laid back. Your life is not in danger in the South, you know what I mean? Playing jazz, you know. Although Joe Sample did tell us a story about...
Joe Sample from the Crusaders.
Yeah, Joe Sample from the Crusaders. I asked him, you know, how they developed their sound. He said, yeah, we'd be in the Texas-Louisiana border trying to play jazz for folks who have been drinking and wanted to dance. And they experienced the same thing. And he said, you know, we were trying to play the cerebral jazz. And they said, look, man, we paid 25 cents at the front door. And if you don't start making us feel good, things are going to get bad in here. You know what I mean? And Joe said we became instant funk masters. You know what I mean? So your environment absolutely creates your identity.